I just want to ask the question, like, what is it that politicians and public health officials are now trying to achieve in their response to COVID? I'm genuinely perplexed, because here's what I thought. They began. My only request is choose your story and stick to it, because the constant flitting around with different reasons for why you're proposing different policies is eroding public trust. No one is going to believe anything you say in the future if you keep on changing the message. So for 5,452 cases in Calgary, there was no need to have a mandatory mask. But now that there's 230 cases in Calgary, oh my gosh, you have to have mandatory masks. Oh my gosh, if you don't start wearing them, the mayor's going to punish you, bringing forward a motion on July 20th, forcing you to wear them. What in the world is going on here? I don't know that I have the answer, but this doesn't look like science to me. This kind of looks like politics to me. And
I mean, this is the question. Why not in April or in March? And I think Alberta was just a little bit ahead of Ontario in terms of when the cases were coming. But, you've got 230 active cases, as you said, in Calgary right now, out of a total confirmed cases of almost 5,500. Well, we were having 675 cases a day in the middle of April, and we were still being told, no, you don't need to do that. They weren't saying save them for healthcare workers.
Yeah, that's our wicked problem. There are things we can do, and we are doing and will be doing over the next couple of days to try and address this. It's a reflection of how challenging it is for healthcare workers to feel very vulnerable, as we are, working in these situations, worrying about getting sick ourselves, worrying about passing it on to our families, our homes, but also being able to care for people effectively. And it's a challenge that we have 9 long-term care facility outbreaks where additional protections are needed in those facilities. And then we now have increasing numbers of people in hospital, and that is going through way more personal protective equipment than we expected. So we are on a tenuous level right now, but we do have a plan for that. We've had a plan for a number of months about how to address that, and there are things that we can do that we've seen being done in other places that are based on evidence around how we can cohort patients, for example, so people don't have to change their masks or respirators and eye protection between each patient, because you're dealing with everybody who has the same thing. So there are things that we will be doing over the coming days, and we can have more details once we've worked it out with the healthcare worker leaders and with our hospital leaders over the next 48 hours. We are also absolutely looking at all aspects of things that we can do to increase our stockpiles of personal protective equipment. Particularly, there's good evidence that you can reuse certain types of equipment if it's been cleaned appropriately, and we're looking at how we can do that. We're also looking at alternate supplies from around the world.
I've got a small collection of N95s here that my work provided to me if I need to go out. On the job, they provided me with a health and safety kit. But I also have a cloth mask, and that's what I wear going into stores now that it's mandatory here. Why didn't we do this when we were seeing 675 new cases a day in Ontario? Why are we moving to masks now when the number of cases are going down? In fact, let me just bring up today's case numbers. We are at 118 new cases on July 8th. Which means they were tested yesterday. So on the day that masks became mandatory in Toronto, Mississauga, Brampton, Ottawa, and the entire rural area surrounding the nation's capital, which means more than half of the province's population have to wear masks, we had 118 new people test.
So the first 36,000 cases, no need for mandatory masks, but you've got now 118 new ones, and everybody's got a lockdown wearing a mask. That's what I am mystified by. Why now? Why all of a sudden?
Because politicians always like to be seen doing something. Until now, reporters have asked consistently about wearing masks, and until recently, it was no, don't. Then it became, well, if it makes you feel better, go ahead. Then it became, well, we kind of recommend it if you can't social distance. Now it's mandatory. We're still told we've got to keep 6 feet apart, which is apparently better even than wearing a mask. But now as cases are disappearing, we're told you've got to wear a mask. This is pure politics. If it had been done in March, so cases in Canada really started to take off in early to mid-March. Outside of the cluster in British Columbia that was in that one long-term care facility,
yeah.
In most of the country where we had problems, Alberta, British Columbia, Quebec, and Ontario, it was around March 10th. If in that time frame, between then and the end of April, we had said, medical officials had said, we recommend you wear masks going out, we probably could have reduced infections.
Yeah. And you know what? I think most people would have accepted it at that time as well, because we didn't know very much about it. We didn't know how much it would spread. There was all of these wild predictions about how many people would die. So I think they probably could have had that message at the time, and people would have abided by it.
And instead, we were told not to. Now,
is Canada not telling the public to wear masks because we're worried about a shortage and we want to make sure that doctors and other frontline people have them?
I think there's two separate reasons. I think for sure, absolutely, we want to protect our frontline healthcare workers, and prioritizing supply in that setting is critically important. And we're looking at all sorts of different avenues to procure. For the public, I think the current scientific evidence we are continuing to evaluate. Of course, we can be flexible if we find any new evidence. But I think the scientific evidence is that if you are sick, then put on a mask to prevent those droplets from flying, in any space as you're perhaps going to a clinic or having to move yourself around the community for essential needs. Putting a mask on an asymptomatic person is not beneficial, obviously, if you're not infected. If you're a close contact of a case, and under certain circumstances, especially, you'll also be in self-isolation, by the way, if you're a close contact of a case. And you also need to move for any essential reason. That's perhaps another situation. What we worry about is actually the potential negative aspects of wearing masks, where people are not protecting their eyes, or other aspects of where the virus could enter your body, and that gives you a false sense of confidence. But also, it increases the touching of your face. If you think about it, if you got a mask around your face, sometimes you can't help it because you're just touching parts of your face. The other thing is the outside of the mask could be contaminated as well. So the key is hand washing, absolutely, for sure. It doesn't matter what you're doing, hand washing is really key. When you're removing a mask, in numerous infectious diseases, even in the hospital setting, we find that it's removing personal protective equipment that can actually lead to infections. So if people try to use these measures, they have to be really, really careful and wash their hands. Absolutely, that's the key. So we're also worried about the negative, potentially negative impacts.
So tell me how this works with, say, for instance, like I can see how it could work in retail stores and in grocery stores. I don't understand how it works when you go out for dinner. How do you go to a restaurant and enjoy a beer and wings with your friends if you have to wear a mask?
So we only have restaurants. You can do takeout, you can do delivery, or you can sit on an outdoor patio. They only recently adjusted it because previously, if there was any sort of rooftop above you, even on an outdoor patio, you couldn't open it. And they adjusted that because, there are places where there's an overhang, a natural overhang of the building, but everything else is wide open. They said, okay, you can open that. We're not allowed indoors. So, I met with someone yesterday for lunch. We had to wear a mask going through the restaurant to get to their patio, and then we could take it off and sit and talk and eat.
So you don't have to wear it on the patio. So basically, if Annette Nenshi, our mayor in Calgary, comes through with this mask plan, it means he's essentially going to shut down the indoors of restaurants because there's no possible way to be in compliance. You can't sit and enjoy a meal indoors.
Or they'll have to make an exception for restaurants.
But then if you're going to make an exception, then it reveals it all to be baloney, doesn't it?
Maybe, yes. I mean, look, there are a lot of problems with this, and my main one is that whether it's masks or whether it's large gatherings, our leaders have politicized the science around this while claiming that it's all about pure science. Yet, we were told that we can't gather on a beach. There's too many people at the beach. Every weekend, Premier Doug Ford and Toronto Mayor John Tory are, what are you going to do to crack down on the beaches? Meanwhile, we had mass rallies for Black Lives Matters over the past several weeks. We continue to have some of them. That's not a problem.
But you know what? The numbers seem to
such a rally.
But
that's
Brian,
not a problem.
The numbers seem to validate that. All of you would be expecting now to see a massive surge in cases for all those who were out protesting a few weeks ago, and instead you've got a couple of minor surges in cases here and there. So it actually kind of validates.
Has one, and some others don't, which is fine. But the political leaders tell us one is good, the other's bad. They tell us don't wear a mask when cases are high. They tell us we have to wear a mask as cases are dwindling. Okay, don't tell me this is pure science. This is you doing political posturing. Again,
okay, now let me pause you.
Opposed to politicians playing the scientist when they're clearly not.
Okay, and that's what I want to understand is what are the politics behind this? Brian Lilley is my guest. He's political columnist for the Toronto Sun. I want to play one more clip for you, and then we'll get your thoughts on what you think Calgary should do. This is the difference, right? Like, I don't know if the mayor's trying to be trendy because they're now talking about this in the big city of Toronto, and so he's got to do it too. But we have different provincial rules here. You don't even have a limitation anymore in restaurants indoors on seat limitation. All you have to do is just keep people 6 people apart. Or 6 feet apart. You can't overlay this indoor mask mandate without crushing the restaurant sector again, which has just been sitting there crushed for the last 3 months. Aha, that's the big difference. I was wondering, how are they going to do this in restaurants? Well, that's the solution. They don't allow you to sit in restaurants. Brian Lilley is my guest. He's a political columnist for the Toronto Sun. Brian, I must tell you, I run a restaurant and have been since May, and I went out last night to a restaurant, and the place was packed. Everyone was sitting 6 feet apart, but we are totally out and about and happy to have restaurant meals. I think we're all sick of our home cooking. One of the things I wanted to ask you about the patio servers, do they still wear masks even though you as a customer doesn't have to?
Yeah, and so I was at a sushi restaurant yesterday. They were wearing a mask. An Italian restaurant, a trendy spot of Toronto. And then before Toronto opened up, a city just north of Toronto called Barrie opened up, and I went and visited their waterfront because they were allowed to have restaurants on patios and we weren't. And I go by a Hooters, and you know how little they wear at Hooters, but they still had masks and gloves on.
Well, at least they had the masks on. Okay, so give me your impression of things then. What is the politics behind this?
I think there's a few things. I think some folks in the media are determined that we all have to wear masks. Some of the biggest worry words throughout this have been people in the media who just keep saying, please do something to protect me, please. Media are constantly saying, what will you do to protect people? What will you do? And so politicians, you remember your time as a politician, sometimes you or your staff feel like, well, we got to do something. Give them something. And I think somebody came up with this idea that we all have to wear masks. The media have been complaining to Doug Ford, why won't you make this a mandatory thing across the province? He says, well, there's parts of the province that haven't had a single case in weeks.
Exactly.
23 out of 34 health units have had no cases recently. So why do you tell, like Thunder Bay or Renfrew or Sudbury, you got to wear a mask? Why? Because people in Toronto are sick. Well, that's in the case of Thunder Bay, it's like a 2-day drive. In the case of Renfrew, you're talking a 6-hour drive. That'll
never fly. Hey, listen, I've got to play just this most recent clip from Fauci so that you can see the new modern reason why he's now changed his mind on why mask wearing should happen. I want to get your take on this.
About a month or so, or 2 or 3 ago, when people were saying, you don't really need to wear a mask. Well, the reason for that is that we were concerned, the public health community, and many people were saying this, were concerned that it was at a time when personal protective equipment, including the N95 masks and the surgical masks, were in very short supply. And we wanted to make sure that the people, namely the healthcare workers, who were brave enough to put themselves in harm's way to take care of people who were infected with the coronavirus and the danger of them getting infected. We did not want them to be without the equipment that they needed.
I think that's bogus. It's because we were worried that everybody would go out and buy a 95 mask and we wouldn't get them. Everybody's wearing their own homemade mask or cloth mask. They could have said, keep the N95s for the healthcare workers and a cloth mask is fine. So this sounds like a little bit of trying to justify why the policy has changed now. What do you think? Are you happy there, Brian?
Hello?
Oh, yeah, go
Can
ahead.
you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah,
it's not what Dr. Fauci said at the time. It's not what Dr. Tam said at the time. It's not what Dina Hinshaw said at the time. They all said it could be do more harm than good. And you can't turn around and then say, but we just wanted to save them for the people that needed them. If that's what you meant, then say it. Don't play games with us, though. Don't pee on my leg and tell me it's raining. And that's what they're trying to do right now.
All right, Brian Lilley. Always love talking to you. Thanks for your time today.
Thank you.
Please, someone tell me how that's going to happen. If you're sitting in one of those wonderful restaurants that are now packed to the gills everywhere you go, how are they going to enforce a mandatory mask policy? I ask you. 403-974-8255 if you want to give me some text. If you figured out the answer to this puzzle, I'd be delighted to share it. Let's stay. We'll switch to a different topic when we return. Bill.
Dr. Fauci, I want to ask you specifically about masks. Now, I'm in South Carolina right now, and there's not a whole lot of people wearing masks. So I want to ask you specifically, can you define for people what the role of masks is? And why were we told to wait? Why were we told later in the spring to wear them when we initially were told not to?
Okay, that's a good question, and I'm glad that you asked and to give me the opportunity to clarify it. So let's start with your first question. Masks are not 100% protective. However, they certainly are better than not wearing a mask, both to prevent you, if you happen to be a person who maybe feels well but has an asymptomatic infection that you don't even know about, to prevent you from infecting someone else. But also, it can protect to a certain degree, not 100%, in protecting you from getting infected from someone who either is breathing or coughing or sneezing or singing or whatever it is in which the droplets or the aerosols go out. So masks work. The important thing is actually physical separation. So physical separation that we talk about all the time is the best way to get a virus not to get to you. But often it's impossible physically, logistically, to be physically separated to the right extent from everyone. And that's the reason why we combine physical separation with a mask, even though a mask is not 100% protective, but it does give you some protection. So you shouldn't discount that. Now, getting back to your first question, which was what about a month or so, or 2 or 3 ago, when people were saying, you don't really need to wear a mask. Well, the reason for that is that we were concerned, the public health community, and many people were saying this, were concerned that it was at a time when personal protective equipment, including the N95 masks and the surgical masks, were in very short supply. And we wanted to make sure that the people, namely the healthcare workers, who were brave enough to put themselves in harm's way to take care of people who were infected with the coronavirus and the danger of them getting infected, we did not want them to be without the equipment that they needed. So there was not enthusiasm about going out and everybody buying a mask or getting a mask. We were afraid that that would deter away from the people who really needed it. Now we have masks. We know that you don't need an N95 if you're a ordinary person in the street. We also know that simple cloth coverings that many people have can work as well as a mask in many cases. So right now, unequivocally, The recommendation is when you're out there, particularly if you're in a situation where there's active infection, keep the distance physically and wear a mask. So although there appeared to be some contradiction of you were saying this then, and why are you saying this now? Actually, the circumstances have changed. That's the reason why.